Evelyn hadn't intended to end up in the mansion. But when the letters from publishers grew fewer and farther between, when her phone sat silent on the desk and the hours stretched into days without meaning, she had felt the pressure building. A writer's life was never supposed to feel like this, she had thought. But here she was, on the winding, narrow road leading to a place forgotten by time. The mansion had always been part of the town's hushed conversations, a relic of an era, long past. Its owner, an eccentric man named Reginald Thorne, had vanished mysteriously, leaving his sprawling estate to deteriorate. The locals rarely spoke of it, for fear of invoking the ghosts of its past. The house itself was ancient like something, torn from the pages of a Gothic novel. Its exterior, crumbling yet proud, stood atop a hill, surrounded by towering trees and the mist that rolled in from the nearby river. To anyone who came upon it, the mansion seemed to be waiting, anticipating the arrival of someone who might breathe life back into its rotting bones. Evelyn had first heard of it while stopping in town for supplies. A small, scruffy innkeeper had told her of the place as if it were a secret, an unspoken invitation. "You need a place to write, miss?" the old man had asked, his voice gravelly. "No, just the spot, but not for the faint of heart." First, she had laughed it off, dismissing the notion. But the idea lingered. After weeks of writer's block and failed attempts at connecting with the outside world, Evelyn found herself driving toward the mansion. She had nothing left to lose. The isolation promised what she needed, a space free from distractions, a room with just enough sunlight and just enough shadow to coax her writing into existence again. And so, on a bleak and overcast afternoon, Evelyn parked her car at the foot of the long gravel driveway. The mansion loomed ahead, casting an intimidating shadow, its windows like hollow eyes, staring blankly into the world. For a moment, she hesitated, the hairs on the back of her neck standing up. But the thought of a fresh start, the promise of solitude pushed the unease aside. She grabbed her bags from the trunk, the air thick with moisture, and walked up to the front door. As she approached, it swung open by itself, creaking as though it had been waiting for her. A chill ran down her spine, but again, she brushed it off. The caretaker, Mr. Hollis, stood in the threshold. He was an old man, bent with age, his face a tapestry of wrinkles, but his eyes were sharp and nervingly so. His graying hair fell in uneven tufts around his face, and he wore a long, faded coat despite the warm weather. His smile slow but warm. "Miss Sinclair, I presume?" His voice was soft but carried the weight of 100 secrets. Evelyn smiled nervously, stepping inside. "Yes, that's me. Thank you for letting me stay here. It's my duty, miss," he said, his smile never fading. "The mansion requires someone to care for it. It watches over those who dwell here, keeps them safe." Evelyn's skin prickled at his words. "Keeps them safe," she repeated, unsure whether to laugh or be concerned. "Yes, the house has its ways," he said cryptically, stepping aside to let her pass. "But I'll leave you to it. Dinner's at 7 sharp, and I'll be right here if you need anything. Just ... don't stray too far after dark." She nodded, taking his strange warning with a grain of salt. He didn't seem like the type to joke, but there was a hint of something in his voice, something almost like pity. Still, she didn't dwell. On it, she had come for peace, for clarity. That was all that mattered. As Mr. Hollis disappeared into the house's bowels, Evelyn took in her surroundings. The grand foyer was dark, the only light coming from a set of tall windows at the far end, partially obscured by dust. The air smelled of old wood, like a library left untouched for decades. The walls were lined with dark, intricately carved panels, giving the space an air of faded opulence. It was beautiful, but haunting, like a painting too worn to reveal its original splendor. After a long journey, the weight of her bags seemed lighter, and she felt a surge of relief here. In this place, she would find her words again. She would make herself believe that the world outside didn't matter. Here, in the shadow of the mansion, she could be alone, free to think, to write, to live as she had always wanted. As she explored the house, she found that it seemed almost too vast for one person. Long hallways stretched beyond her vision, their ends hidden in darkness. A grand staircase spiraled upward, its steps worn smooth by countless feet. In the dining room, a long table stood covered in fine dust, as though it had been years since anyone had sat at it. The house seemed ... expectant, not in a way that made her uncomfortable, but in a way that tugged at her curiosity. Every creak of the floorboards echoed like a beckoning whisper. Later that evening, after a sparse meal prepared by Mr. Hollis, Evelyn retired to the library, where she would set up her writing desk. The room was lined with shelves of books, their spines cracked and faded. It felt like the perfect place to start again, to dive into the world of words and forget about the outside world. She unpacked her things, spreading out her notebooks and pens, then sat down by the window. The view was stunning, the trees thick and dark, stretching into the horizon. The library was quiet, but it was not peaceful. There was something about the silence that felt ... too complete, as if the house itself were holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. It was then that she heard a soft, scraping sound coming from somewhere deep in the house. At first, she dismissed it. Old houses made strange noises, but the sound persisted, growing louder, closer. It was almost as if someone was moving furniture. Her heart began to race. "Mr. Hollis," she called out hesitantly, her voice barely. Above a whisper, there was no answer. She rose from her chair, her eyes scanning the room, but the source of the noise was gone. The house seemed to exhale in the sudden quiet. It was probably just the wind, she thought, shaking her head. She was tired. The drive had been long, and she had let her imagination run wild. There was no reason to be afraid. But as she returned to her desk, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. Something had been awakened the moment she stepped inside the house. Deep down, she knew that it was no coincidence. That she had come here, the house, she realized, had been waiting for her. The following days unfolded with a strange stillness, as if time itself were suspended inside the mansion's walls. Evelyn settled into a routine, a pattern that was familiar yet unnerving. Every morning she woke to the same gray mist that hung over the mansion like a shroud. The house seemed to breathe around her, its walls creaking, shifting as though alive. But the deeper she sank into her writing, the more she began to feel its pull, the tug of isolation and quietude that had once been soothing. Now slowly seeping into her mind, her writing desk sat in the large, dusty library, nestled by the window, that looked out onto the dense forest beyond. From this vantage point, Evelyn could see nothing but an endless stretch of trees, their branches twisting and stretching toward the sky in grotesque patterns. The air outside was thick with fog, but Evelyn found the scene oddly mesmerizing, even as it seemed to grow darker with each passing day. The mansion had been designed for grandeur. Once the home of a wealthy family whose name had been lost to time, every corner held the remnants of a forgotten history. Ancient portraits lined the walls, their oil-painted eyes forever gazing downward, some with the faintest hint of a smile that seemed to follow her as she moved from room to room. And the library, well, it was the heart of the house. With towering shelves that stretched up to the high ceiling, their spines worn and yellowed with age. Most of the books were ancient, their words faded or unintelligible, but Evelyn found herself drawn to them, feeling as if they had a secret to share. At night she would sit at her desk typing furiously on her old typewriter. The clacking of the keys was the only sound in the room, save for the occasional groan of the house. Her mind poured onto the page, her thoughts taking shape in a way that hadn't happened for months. It was as if the mansion itself was pulling the words out of her, forcing her to write faster, to keep up with the steady stream of ideas flowing through her. But each morning, as she read over the work she'd produced the night before, she was left with a feeling of unease. The words were good, better than good, but there was something off about them. They were not hers. They didn't feel like her own. The more she wrote, the more the stories seemed to change, taking on an unfamiliar tone, like the hand of an unseen editor had been guiding her. She shook it off. It was probably fatigue, or the pressure of being away from civilization for so long. The house, after all, was an odd place, one that seemed to distort reality itself, pulling her deeper into its grip with every passing hour. Then, on the fourth night, things began to shift in a way that Evelyn couldn't ignore. She had been writing late into the evening, her fingers moving quickly over the typewriter, when a peculiar sensation crept over her. The room was darker than usual, darker than it should have been for the time of night. She glanced up, her eyes narrowing as she stared out the window. The fog had rolled in thicker than it ever had before, so dense it seemed to envelop the house.
Hey!
It pressed against the glass like a living thing, its tendrils creeping along the edges of the panes. The trees outside were no longer visible, just a soft, shifting mass of gray and black. Evelyn hesitated, her fingers still poised above the keys. She didn't remember the fog getting so thick, and for a moment, she thought she saw something moving outside the window shapes, silhouettes, lurking just beyond her sight. She pushed herself away from the desk, stepping closer to the window for a better look. The air inside the library was thick with the scent of old paper and dust. The house was silent, but the silence felt suffocating, as though it was waiting for something important. And then, just as quickly as it came, the feeling passed. She blinked, looking out the window again, but all she saw was the impenetrable gray fog. There was nothing there. She took a deep breath, willing herself to shake off the unease that was slowly creeping into her mind. It was just the fog, just the house playing tricks on her. But when she turned back to her desk, the typewriter was no longer in the same position. The chair had moved. At first, she thought it was a trick of her eyes, but as she walked closer, her stomach tightened. The chair was no longer in the place where she had left it, positioned neatly against the desk. It had been pushed back, its seat angled slightly toward the corner of the room. Her heart began to beat faster. No one had been in here with her. She was certain of that. And yet, the chair was not as she had left it. She stood there, staring at it for what felt like an eternity. The silence of the house was overwhelming. Evelyn could hear her own breathing, ragged and shallow. She reached out to move the chair back into place, but her hand froze just before it touched the wood. The chair, no. The room itself felt different. The air was heavier here, charged with an energy she couldn't quite explain. It was as though something was watching her, something waiting. She quickly stepped back, her pulse quickening. She needed to get out of this room, needed to shake off the suffocating feeling that was slowly wrapping around her chest. She turned toward the door. But then she heard it, a soft whisper barely audible over the pounding of her own heart. Evelyn, she froze. Her name, it was unmistakable. Breath caught in her throat, and she slowly turned back toward the typewriter. Her fingers trembled at her sides. She was alone. She had to be. Again, the whisper came, this time louder, more insistent. Evelyn, the voice wasn't hers. It wasn't even human. It was thin, strained, like something caught between life and death, slithered through the air, wrapping itself around her like a coil, making it hard to breathe. She backed away from the desk, her feet stumbling over the worn floorboards. The whisper grew louder, more frantic, more urgent, and then, with a final, jarring scrape of metal, the typewriter's keys slammed down on their own. One by one they clacked, producing a line of text, another sentence. But not one she had written. It read, "It is already too late." The cold dread that surged through Evelyn's veins almost knocked her to her knees. She didn't know why, but she knew somehow that this wasn't just a strange coincidence. The house, the mansion, had been waiting for her, and now it was taking hold. The air in the mansion had grown heavier with each passing day. Evelyn found herself retreating deeper into its labyrinthine corridors, a prisoner to her own thoughts as the shadows seemed to stretch longer and longer. The fog outside refused to lift, and the trees beyond the mansion grew twisted, as if they, too, had been influenced by the house's strange energy. It wasn't just the weather, though something had changed inside Evelyn as well. At night, she would wake in a cold sweat, heart hammering in her chest. The same feeling of being watched lingered, always just out of reach, like a half-formed memory she couldn't quite place. It wasn't that she heard things or saw things, no. It was worse than that. It was a sense and intuition that the house had taken root within her mind. The library, her refuge for the past several days, had grown more oppressive. The books once a comfort now seemed to stare at her from the shelves, their pages filled with secrets they were desperate to share. But there was one thing in particular that had begun to plague her: the mirror. It was a large, ornate affair, sitting on the far wall of the library. Its frame was gold, intricately carved with swirling patterns that seemed to change depending on the angle at which Evelyn looked at it. First, she had passed it by without much thought, absorbed in the act of writing. But over time, she became more and more drawn to it. The reflection within offering her something that the other rooms didn't. Each time she glanced into the glass, she would see herself, of course she did. But it wasn't quite right. Her reflection was always just a little too slow, too deliberate, as if the mirror held a delay, an echo of what she was doing a moment behind her. At first, she wrote it off as nothing more than her tired eyes playing tricks. But after a few days, the sensation had intensified. It was as though the reflection wasn't mimicking her actions at all, but rather anticipating them, moving before she did. One evening, after a long day of writing that left her fingers sore and her thoughts scattered, Evelyn found herself standing before the mirror, brushing her hair absent-mindedly. She watched the strands fall from her fingers, her reflection doing the same. But with one subtle difference: it was smiling. Her reflection, her own face, was smiling at first. She thought it was an illusion, a trick of the light. But as she stepped closer to the mirror, her smile faltered. The reflection remained still, its smile not one of joy, but of something darker. The eyes in the glass were not hers. There was a coldness to them, an emptiness, a feeling of ... hunger. Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. She blinked, but the smile remained. She turned her head quickly, expecting to catch a glimpse of movement in the reflection that wasn't hers.
Oh.
But there was nothing. It was as though the mirror itself had become a window to something far darker, a place that didn't align with the real world. Her heart thudded in her chest as she reached out to touch the glass, half expecting it to be cold. But it wasn't. The surface was warm, unnaturally so, and her hand tingled as she pressed it against the mirror. The warmth felt almost alive, pulsing against her skin, as if the glass was breathing with her. She jerked her hand back, heart racing, and staggered away from the mirror, trying to shake off the growing sense of panic. The room around her felt even colder now, and the shadows stretched deeper than before, pressing in on her from all sides. The house had been silent for so long, but now, as she stared at her reflection once more, it felt as though the silence was waiting for something. She glanced at the door, her instinct telling her to leave, to flee the room before something worse happened. But her feet wouldn't move. Her eyes remained locked on the mirror, unable to look away. Then the reflection shifted. Slowly, deliberately, her reflection raised its hand to the glass, matching her movements. Evelyn froze. She hadn't raised her hand yet. The reflection, however, did. The fingers pressed against the glass in perfect unison with her own. It was almost as if the other Evelyn in the mirror was mocking her, a silent echo of everything she wasn't. And then, without warning, the reflection's fingers pressed through the glass, distorting and stretching the surface. Evelyn gasped, stumbling back, her pulse racing. It wasn't possible. Mirrors didn't do that. But the glass warped, as though it were no longer solid. Something from within the reflection reached out toward her. For a moment, it was nothing but her own ragged breathing, her chest heaving. As the terror began to claw at her, the mirror seemed to pulse, its surface rippling as though it were alive. A voice low and harsh spoke from the depths of the glass. Evelyn. Her name was drawn out like a chant, but it was distorted, warped. The voice was not hers. It was cold and distant, like the last whisper of someone long gone. With a scream, Evelyn backed away, her hands trembling as she turned to flee the library. The door slammed shut behind her before she could reach it. Her body froze, and she turned to look at the mirror once more. The reflection was now entirely different. It was no longer her at all. The face staring back at her was gaunt, hollow-eyed, and twisted in agony. The lips moved as though trying to form words, but the sounds were lost buried beneath the pulse of the dark energy that seemed to fill the room. The figure in the glass reached toward her again, fingers splayed wide, and then, as if it had all been some kind of cruel joke, the mirror returned to normal. Evelyn's breath was coming in short, panicked bursts. She didn't know how long she'd stood there, her body frozen in place, but eventually the chill of the room reached her, and she moved instinctively toward the door again. The house was silent now, as if nothing had happened. But everything had changed. As Evelyn stepped back into the hallway, she knew that something was wrong, something far worse than she had realized. The mirror wasn't just a reflection. It was a doorway, a window into something other. And whatever was in there, whatever had reached out to her, wasn't finished. It was waiting, watching, and it wasn't going to stop. The next day was colder than the one before. The sun, though it struggled to break through the dense clouds, failed to warm the house. Evelyn sat at her desk in the library, the air around her thick with a sense of unease she couldn't shake. The mirror lingered in her mind, its warped reflection still haunting her every thought. She had tried to push the incident from her mind, telling herself that it was some kind of hallucination, a trick of light or fatigue. But deep down, she knew better. The house had changed. Something in the air, something in the walls had shifted. She could feel it now, its presence, like an invisible weight pressing down on her chest. The typewriter sat before her, an intimidating presence in the corner of her eye, but she was too unsettled to write. She didn't even want to look at it. It had been the one to speak the night before, its keys slamming down of their own accord to form words that she hadn't typed. It is already too late. Her heart twisted as she thought of the message. Her stomach churned and she stood, pacing the room. The urge to leave, to flee the house entirely, was becoming unbearable. Had to get away, she had to leave. But where would she go? The nearest town was miles away, and the roads even now were nearly impassable from the relentless fog that had been hanging over the mansion for days. Even the thought of stepping out into that opaque, suffocating mist made her feel claustrophobic. And then there was the voice. She had heard it, felt. It's echoing in the corners of her mind, always just out of reach, whispering her name in tones that were both inviting and horrifying. She could almost hear it now. The thought of it caused her to stop pacing and glance toward the door, where the eerie silence of the house seemed to press in from all sides. It was then that she heard it again, softer this time, but unmistakable. Evelyn. Heart skipped a beat. She spun, looking toward the corner of the room, but saw nothing. There was no one here, no one but her. A shiver ran down her spine as the voice echoed once more, louder now, more insistent. Evelyn. The air around her seemed to vibrate with the sound, a strange low hum that reverberated through her bones. She could feel it in her chest, the pressure building, tightening around her lungs. Her skin prickled as if an invisible presence was drawing near, brushing past her like a shadow she couldn't escape. She stumbled back, instinctively reaching for the door. But before she could open it, she heard something else's sound, faint, but growing clearer. It was coming from downstairs, from the depths of the house, as if someone was walking slowly, methodically. Through the darkened hallways, footsteps, slow, uneven, and not her own. Her breath caught in her throat as she realized that she wasn't alone. The house wasn't empty, was never empty. Her hands trembled as she tightened her grip on the door handle. She had to get out now, the thought of being trapped in this place, surrounded by whatever it was that had taken hold of her, sent a jolt of panic through her, but before she could turn the handle, the footsteps stopped. There was silence again. Evelyn stood there, frozen, her body rigid with fear. It was as if the house were holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Something is coming. The whispering voice filled her mind again, louder this time, more persistent. She backed away from the door slowly, her eyes scanning the room. For some means of escape, the windows. She could break one, crawl out. Closer now, and her heart pounded in her chest. Double quotes, Evelyn. ... The voice was no longer a whisper. It was clear, real. It echoed through her skull, its deep, hollow resonance filling her head, and then the door to the library slammed open. Evelyn gasped, her hands instinctively lifting to cover her ears, though. The voice still pressed into her skull. She was shaking, the tremors running through her whole body. The air was thick with dread, but there was no one there. The hallway was empty, her chest heaving. She staggered backward, her eyes wild as she searched for an explanation, for anything that would make sense of the terror that was steadily consuming her. She was being driven mad, this place, this cursed mansion, was toying with her sanity. The shadows in the hallway began to move, stretching, coiling like living things, slithering along the walls, growing longer. They danced in the corners of her vision, and every time she turned to look, they vanished. But the pressure in the air grew thicker, like the very house was closing in on her. There was no escape. She turned back toward the desk, her mind reeling as she tried to find some clarity, some rational thought to cling to. Her hands shook uncontrollably as she sat down, her fingers gripping the cold metal of the typewriter. The keys clicked under her touch, unbidden, as if they were no longer hers to command. And then, without warning, a single word appeared on the paper. Run, her breath hitched in her throat. She stared at the word, her heart pounding wildly as she read it over and over. But before she could react, the typewriter began to type again, faster this time, its keys clacking furiously. Run, run, run. Her fingers twitched, as if the machine had a will of its own, as if it were commanding her. The words filled the page in jagged, frantic lines, each one more urgent than the last. She didn't need to be told twice. Evelyn sprang from her seat, her breath ragged as she bolted for the door. But the moment her hand reached the handle, she froze. The sound of footsteps again, but this time, they weren't downstairs. They were right behind her. Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. She turned sharply, her eyes darting to the empty hallway. Beyond the door, but there was nothing but the oppressive silence that had begun to feel like an iron weight pressing against her chest. The footsteps had stopped, but the feeling lingered. A presence. She stepped cautiously away from the door, her pulse racing in her ears. Every instinct in her body screamed at her to run, to escape, to do anything but stay in this house for another moment. But she knew deep down that fleeing wasn't an option anymore. No matter where she went, no matter how far she ran, the house would follow. It always did. Evelyn's eyes wandered nervously around the library. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched, that there were eyes on her from every corner of the room. She focused for a moment on the large portraits that hung on the walls. The faces in them seemed to stare down at hers, some of them with faint, crooked smiles, others with hollow, emotionless gazes that made her stomach twist. There was something wrong about them. She had noticed the portraits when she first arrived at the mansion, but she hadn't given them much thought. Old family members, she assumed ancestors of whoever had once lived here. But now, their eyes seemed alive, watching, following her as she moved. Each one seemed to exude a strange energy, something old and dark. The painted eyes glistened in the dim light of the room. Evelyn could feel their gaze like a physical thing, weighing down on her. One portrait in particular caught her eye. It was a large, imposing frame at the far end of the room. The painting depicted a man, tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a dark suit with a faint, knowing smile on his lips. His hair was neatly combed, his eyes sharp and calculating. But what disturbed her most was not the man himself. It was the way he seemed to be looking at her, as though he were waiting for something. His gaze was intense, and something about it felt too alive. Too aware, Evelyn swallowed hard and tore her eyes away from the painting. Her body was moving on its own now, as if her mind had lost control. She felt the need to get closer to it, to understand why it felt so. Alive, she had to know. Her feet carried her across the room, and before she knew it, she was standing. Before the portrait, the man's eyes stared down at her with unnerving precision, and her breath caught in her throat. The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end. She reached out a trembling hand to touch the frame. And the moment her fingers brushed against the cold wood, the house seemed to shift. The air grew heavier, denser, as if the walls themselves were closing in, and then the painting changed. The smile on the man's lips widened, stretching impossibly wide, too wide for a human mouth. His eyes gleamed with an almost predatory light, and the longer she stared at it, the more it seemed like the entire painting was shifting, like the man was no longer confined to the canvas, but was instead stretching toward her. Evelyn's breath caught in her throat as she stumbled back, but her eyes remained locked on the portrait. Was it moving? The man's eyes, no longer cold and calculating, began to follow her. His lips twisted into a grin that was filled with malice, a knowing grin, as if he were savoring some unseen pleasure. She could feel his gaze deep inside her, crawling beneath, her skin digging into her very soul. Suddenly, a soft, guttural noise filled the air, a whisper, low and indistinct. It was coming from the painting. From the man's mouth, she couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. It was commanding. The whisper grew louder. She could hear it now, clear and sharp in her mind, as though the voice was speaking directly to her. You should not have come here. The words echoed in her mind, their icy touch sinking deep into her thoughts. Without thinking, Evelyn spun around, her body trembling as the whisper continued, growing louder, more insistent. She had to get out of the room, had to escape. Took one step back, and then another, her feet moving faster, her heart pounding in her chest. The whisper didn't stop. It followed her. Leave now. But then the walls, the portraits, everything seemed to blur, to shift. The room twisted, in on itself, as though the house were alive, bending reality, distorting time and space. Evelyn's head was spinning. Her vision swam as the air thickened, pulling at her, suffocating her. The whispers multiplied. She couldn't tell if they were coming from the portraits, or from the walls, or from inside her own mind. The words were unintelligible now, a cacophony, of voices that seemed to be laughing at her, mocking her. Their tone grew darker, more venomous, as if they were feeding on her fear, growing stronger with every passing second. Too late. Too late? You're already here. A sudden surge of panic flooded through Evelyn's veins. She grabbed her head, trying to block out the noise, but it was like trying to shut out the very pulse of the house. Her vision blurred, her knees gave out beneath her, and she crumpled to the floor in front of the painting. Her hands pressed against her temples, as if to hold her mind together. The whispering didn't stop, and then a movement. The air stilled. For a moment, she had imagined it. But then, she saw it again. The man in the portrait, his smile had changed. It was no longer a grin, but a terrible, jagged sneer. His eyes were no longer watching her. They were glaring at her, filled with a terrible hatred that seemed to pulse. With an otherworldly energy, her heart skipped a beat as she realized he was no longer a painting. The man had stepped from the canvas, his figure moved in jerky, unnatural motions, his limbs extending with grotesque elongations, his face stretching, distorting with every step he took toward her. His lips parted in a low, guttural growl. And then his fingers reached toward her. You are mine now. The voice rumbled from somewhere deep within the painting, as though it had always been inside her. Evelyn screamed, her voice raw with terror as she scrambled to her feet. The room around her spun, and she knew Devlin didn't look back as she ran. The air around her seemed to close in like the grip of some invisible hand. Her lungs burned, her legs ached, but she couldn't stop. Her mind, a whirlwind of panic, only told her one thing: escape. Escape before it was too late. She hurtled down the hallway, the footsteps behind her echoing in the silence, keeping pace with her frantic flight. She didn't dare turn to look.
Oh.
The whispering followed her like a cloud of smoke, curling around her thoughts, seeping into her very skin. You are mine now. The words rang in her mind, a constant refrain that filled her head. Drowning out everything else, she reached the staircase at the end of the hallway, her feet slamming against the old wooden steps, almost tripping as she tried to descend too. Quickly, the house creaked and groaned as though it were alive, as though it were watching her every move. At the bottom of the stairs, she paused only for a moment to catch her breath. The house was unnervingly silent now, too silent, as though all the shadows, all the whispers, had been momentarily suspended in time. She didn't know where to go. The mansion sprawled out before her, corridors and rooms that twisted into each other in a maze. She could run aimlessly through the hallways, but would it matter? The house, it seemed, had a way of finding her, with no better option. Evelyn turned and bolted down another hallway, her feet carrying her into the deep recesses of the mansion. She wasn't sure what she was looking for, or what she even hoped to find. But there had to be something anything could help her. The walls seemed to close in as she moved deeper into the bowels of the mansion. The air was thick with dust, and the faint scent of decay lingered in the corners. She had passed countless doors, each one unremarkable, each one leading to another darkened room. But she had no time to think. She could feel it, a presence, something cold and watching just behind her. She turned a corner and found herself in a long, narrow hallway. At the far end was a door, its edges worn and chipped, but it was different from the others. There was something about it that drew her attention, something that felt like it had been waiting. She approached cautiously, her hand shaking as she gripped the doorknob. It turned easily beneath her touch, as though the door was welcoming her. With a deep breath, Evelyn pushed it open and stepped inside. The room was darker than the others, the air thick and heavy with an unsettling stillness. The walls were lined with shelves, filled with dust-covered objects she couldn't quite make out. The only light came from the dim glow of the dying fireplace at the far end of the room. But it wasn't the shelves that caught her attention. It was what lay in the center of the room. A large circular mirror, its surface tarnished with age and time, stood against the far wall, was framed in dark, intricately carved wood, its edges sharp and twisting like some monstrous vine. The mirror was cracked just slightly, but the crack ran down the center, splitting the glass into two jagged halves. Evelyn's stomach churned as she approached. Something about it, something about the way it seemed to call to her, drew her in. It wasn't just the reflection she feared. It was the silence that filled the room. The silence that had descended when she entered. It was as though the entire mansion had fallen still, holding its breath, waiting for her to make a move. For a moment, Evelyn hesitated. She was so close to the mirror now, she could see her own reflection staring back at her. But there was something wrong with it. Her reflection didn't feel like her. Her hands trembling reached out toward the surface of the glass. She could feel the coldness of it seeping into her fingers as she touched the cracked surface. The glass felt warm beneath her touch, as though the mirror itself was breathing alive. Her heart raced as she traced the crack with her finger. And then, in the reflection, something changed. Her own face shifted subtly at first. The smile that had been on her lips disappeared, replaced by something darker, something twisted. Her eyes had become empty, hollowed out, the pupils wide and black. They stared back at her, unnervingly still, as though they were not her eyes at all. Evelyn pulled her hand back with a sharp gasp, but it was too late. The image in the mirror had already begun to move on its own. It was slow at first, almost imperceptible, but then her reflection began to smile. A wide, grotesque grin stretched across her own face, but she didn't smile. She couldn't. The smile in the mirror wasn't hers. Her heart pounded in her chest as the reflection began to step out of the mirror, slowly, unearthly, like a shadow detached from its owner. Evelyn took a step back, her breath catching in, her throat as her reflection no. Something else advanced toward her. The glass rippled like water, distorting and shifting as the figure moved. Its movements were unnatural, jerky, and it wasn't her. It couldn't be her. The thing in the mirror was wrong, distorted, its body twisting in ways that shouldn't be possible. But there it was. The thing her reflection reached out a hand toward her, its fingers long and clawed, the nails black and gleaming. And in the next instant, it lunged. Evelyn screamed as she staggered backward. But the thing was already too close. Its hand shot through the mirror, wrapping around her wrists with an iron grip. The coldness of its touch burned her skin, seeping through her bones, dragging her toward the glass. She screamed again, clawing at the air. The thing's grip was relentless. It was pulling her toward the mirror. No, no. Evelyn's mind screamed, but her body was already weakening. Her strength drained away, as though the mirror itself were siphoning it from her. She could feel the coldness creeping through her veins, drowning her in the emptiness that filled the reflection. And then, with one last desperate effort, she pulled with everything she had. She yanked herself away from the mirror, her fingers tearing at the jagged crack. But the thing didn't let go, and then crack. The glass shattered beneath her hands. The world around Evelyn seemed to fall away in an instant. The mirror shattered with a deafening crash. Glass splintered into 1,000 jagged pieces, raining down onto the floor like shards of some malevolent truth. Her hands were covered in cuts and blood, but it was the sickening sensation of something else, something cold and vile that lingered. She staggered backward, breathing heavily, her heart thudding in her chest. The room spun, disorienting her, as though the very air had thickened, wrapping around her like an unbreakable web. She wiped at her face, expecting blood, but there was nothing. Just a chill. Just the bitter taste of something, foreign and foul in her mouth. The shattered fragments of the mirror glistened on the floor like shards of a broken reality, each piece reflecting something slightly different, something twisted. Evelyn refused. To look at them, she had to get out of here. The feeling of being watched, of something lurking just behind her, was suffocating, but as she turned to flee, something strange happened. The hallway, the entire house shifted, the walls creaked and groaned, their surfaces warping, bending in unnatural ways. The once familiar corridors stretched impossibly long, each step she took dragging her deeper into the mansion's labyrinthine grip. Her pulse quickened as she realized that the house itself had changed. The door she had just passed through it wasn't there anymore. In its place, a different door, darker, more sinister, stood before her. Her breath caught in her throat as she reached for the handle, but the door wasn't real. It was like a mirage, a twisted reflection of what should have been there. Everything felt wrong. Evelyn spun around, only to find the hallway behind her had closed off. The walls had shifted, sealing her off from the rest of the mansion. Panic surged through her as she pressed her back against the cold, damp wall, the chill from the house seeping into her bones. She was trapped. Trapped in this nightmare. The whispers returned, louder this time. But they weren't just in her mind anymore. They were coming from the very walls, the floor, the ceiling. The house itself seemed to be speaking, its voice 1,000 murmurs, all blending into one, a low, rhythmic chant, like the thrum of an old heartbeat. Leave ... now. You are ... here. The words were jagged, fragmented, but they all had the same meaning. She wasn't supposed to be here. She never was. Evelyn's hands trembled as she pressed her palms against the wall, trying to steady herself. The air grew colder, biting at her skin. She could feel the temperature dropping, the chill seeping into her flesh. It was as if the house was freezing her, trapping her in its frozen grip. She couldn't breathe. Suddenly, a loud bang echoed from behind the door she had tried to escape through, a sound that shook the very foundation of the house. The walls quivered, and the air grew thick with the scent of something rotten, something decaying. Her stomach lurched. Then the door opened. But there was no one there, no one waiting on the other side. Just the hallway, darker and colder than before, as though the darkness had thickened and swallowed everything it touched without thinking. Evelyn stepped forward, driven by some primal instinct to escape the suffocating silence that seemed to press in on her. From all sides, she had barely moved 2 steps when the house responded. The walls groaned and creaked as though the very structure of the mansion was alive, shifting, twisting, and growing. The floor beneath her feet shuddered as something monstrous was waking beneath the surface. Her breath caught in her throat. She wasn't alone. A cold breeze swept down the hallway, carrying with it the unmistakable sound of scraping metal, the low, rhythmic sound of something being dragged along the floor. The air felt charged with static, as though the house were holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Evelyn's pulse raced as she took another step, the scraping sound growing louder, closer. It was coming from somewhere deep within the house, something just beyond her reach. She had to know what it was. She had to understand what was going on. With her heart pounding, she pushed open the door at the end of the hallway, an old heavy door that had always been locked when she'd tried to open it before. Now it creaked open with ease, as if it had been waiting for her. Inside, the room was dark, but there was something else aglow, faint and sickly, emanating from the center. The walls were covered in something Evelyn couldn't quite identify, dark streaks that looked almost like blood. Her stomach turned at the sight, and then she saw it, at the far end of the room. Seated on an old wooden chair was the figure of a man. His back was turned, his face hidden from view, but there was something horribly familiar about him. Her breath hitched as the figure slowly turned toward her. The glow in the room illuminated his face, his gaunt, hollow face, eyes wide, empty, staring back at her with an intensity that pierced into her very soul. It was the man from the portrait. The smile twisted across his face, growing wider, more grotesque, until it was no longer a smile, but a grin filled with hunger and malice. His eyes glistened with something evil, something that made Evelyn's blood run cold. The figure's lips parted. A voice filled the room low, deep and resonant, as if it came from some place beyond the physical realm. Home, Evelyn. Her mind reeled. This wasn't possible. She had seen the portrait. She had seen him. But he was supposed to be a painting. No. This couldn't be happening. Her breath came in shallow gasps as she stumbled backward, her knees weak. Her vision blurred. She could feel herself beginning to lose control. The walls around her seemed to shift again, closing in as if the room itself were alive. The man in the chair leaned forward, his voice rising, filling the room with a sound that was as sharp as glass. You never should have come here. The house. The house calls to you, Evelyn. It always has. And then, as the figure stood and took a slow step toward her, the house around her seemed to buckle and bend, as if the entire world was beginning to collapse. Evelyn turned and fled, but it was already too late. The darkness swallowed her. Whole Evelyn didn't know how long she had been running. Time had become a fluid, meaningless thing within the house, stretched and contracted, its fabric twisted and warped, like a painting left too long under the sun. Hours, or was it mere minutes, had passed since she fled from the figure in the chair, and yet the labyrinth of corridors had refused to release her. Her legs were heavy, her feet dragging, but she kept moving. There was no choice but to run, to escape the house's suffocating presence. The walls, once solid, had now begun to breathe. They moved with her, shifting, stretching, as if the house itself were alive, aware of her every step. The whispering had started again, soft at first, like the faintest rustle of leaves. But it soon grew louder, closer. The voices were everywhere now, woven into the very fabric of the house, seeping into her skin. Leave now. It's too late. The words sounded like a chant, an ancient prayer that filled her mind with dread. Her breath quickened, but she couldn't stop. She wouldn't stop. Not until she found an exit. Not until she could leave this nightmare behind her. Evelyn turned a corner, only to find herself facing another hallway. The same gray, lifeless walls, the same flickering candlelight that cast long, sinister shadows along the floor. It was impossible. She had already passed through this hallway. She had run down this path before, and yet it stretched endlessly. Before her, like an infinite loop, a cruel mockery of time. Her heart raced as she took another step forward. The whispering grew louder, more insistent, like 1,000 voices urging her onward. But the voices weren't comforting. They were harsh, demanding, mocking. You cannot leave. The air turned colder, biting at her skin, and Evelyn stumbled, her knees buckling beneath her. She pressed her hands against the walls to steady herself, but the surface felt wrong. The texture was soft, like flesh. It seemed to ripple beneath her touch. She jerked her hands away, disgusted. But then something moved. The walls seemed to breathe, rising and falling in a grotesque rhythm. The wallpaper peeled back, revealing something behind it, something alive. For a moment, Evelyn could only stare in horror as the surface of the walls rippled and undulated, revealing grotesque faces contorted and twisted, their eyes wide and frantic. The mouths opened, stretching impossibly wide, their screams muffled by the thickness of the walls. Evelyn stumbled backward, choking on her own breath. She had to get out. She had to. A shadow flickered across the far end of the hallway. It was a fleeting movement, barely noticeable, but it was enough to stop her in her tracks. Someone or something was watching her. Her pulse thudded in her ears as she turned her head toward the source of the movement. The hallway, once endless, now felt closer, the air too thick to breathe. And then she saw it. A figure stood at the far end of the hallway. It was tall, almost impossibly so, its silhouette obscured by the dim light. It wasn't moving. It simply stood there, staring at her. And despite the darkness, despite the distance, Evelyn knew it saw her. Presence felt wrong. It wasn't human. No, it wasn't even alive. The figure's face was obscured, but the outline was unmistakable. It was the same figure that had haunted her since she first stepped into the mansion, the man from the portrait. His smile stretched wider, impossibly wide, until it seemed to fill the entire hallway. Evelyn's chest tightened.
Oh.
Her heart skipped. A beat then raced. She had to get away. She couldn't face him, not again. But her legs felt like stone, frozen to the floor. The figure stepped forward, its movement jerky, unnatural. It was no longer just a figure. It was something more, something ancient, something alive, but not alive. Shouldn't have come here, Evelyn? A voice, deep and gravelly, echoed through the hallway. It sounded like the voice of the house itself, layered with the murmurs of 1,000 forgotten souls. Evelyn closed her eyes, shaking her head in disbelief. This couldn't be happening. This had to be a dream. It wasn't real. She opened her eyes, but the figure was still there, growing closer, its face now unmistakable in the dim light. The same face from the portrait. The same hollow eyes that seemed to pierce through her, seeing everything, understanding everything. "You're here now," the voice whispered, and the words seemed to reverberate in the walls, the floor, the very air around her. "You're part of the house." Her hands trembled as she backed away, but the figure did not stop. Her one slow, deliberate step after another, and then the house did something that terrified her more than anything so far. It began to change. The walls warped, bending like soft clay, as though the entire mansion were breathing around her. The floor tilted, the ceiling dropped lower, and the hallway stretched further than she could comprehend. Everything around her seemed to shrink, to contract. Until she couldn't tell where the walls ended and where the darkness began, the figure was no longer the only thing that moved. The very fabric of the house seemed to reach out, its walls twisting toward her, its floors cracking open as though they were trying to swallow her whole. "You belong here," the voice continued, louder now, each word coated in malice. "The house. It knows you, Evelyn. It has always known you." Evelyn's chest tightened, her mind struggling to comprehend what was happening. The house, it was alive, not just in the physical sense, but something deeper. It knew her. It wanted her. The figure took another step forward, and Evelyn stumbled, almost falling. Her legs were too weak, her mind too clouded with fear. She couldn't escape. She couldn't breathe. The walls were closing in, and the figure was getting closer. "Leave me alone." She screamed, her voice raw, desperate, but the sound was swallowed by the house. The air around her thickened, the whispers intensifying until they became a deafening cacophony. Her vision blurred, and she felt the ground shift beneath her feet, the world around her warping and stretching into a nightmare. And then the figure lunged. Her scream was swallowed whole by the darkness. Evelyn's scream was cut off as the darkness swallowed her whole. Her body felt weightless, floating, spinning through an endless void. The air was thick, suffocating, as though the walls themselves had reached out to pull her into some chasm deeper than the house, deeper than time itself. She tried to scream again, but no sound came. It was only the rush of something cold and crushing, pressing against her from all sides. For what felt like an eternity, she drifted in the dark. Her limbs were heavy, unresponsive, as though she were trapped in a dream, a nightmare from which she could not wake. But then, there a flicker of light, A narrow beam of golden warmth cut through the darkness, stretching out before her like a path. Without thinking, without fully understanding why, Evelyn reached for it. She moved toward it as if it were the only thing real, the only thing that could save her. The light grew brighter as she drew closer, till it surrounded her, filling the space with a soft, almost gentle glow. The rush of cold began to dissipate, replaced by something else, something warmer, but equally oppressive. She was no longer falling. She was standing no frozen, on the edge of an infinite abyss. Before her, the mansion loomed. But it wasn't. The mansion she knew wasn't the house of wood and stone and crumbling walls. It was live. The walls undulated like the skin of some massive creature. The floors moved beneath her feet, shifting and slithering like serpents. There were no doors here, no windows. Just the endless, writhing surface of a living, breathing entity. The very fabric of the mansion had come alive, and it was pulsing, throbbing, as if it had a heartbeat of its own. Evelyn's breath caught in her throat as the house seemed to sense her presence. The walls bent and stretched, reaching toward her with outstretched tendrils. She could hear the whispers again, louder now, more distinct. But this time, they weren't just in her head. They were coming from the house itself. "You're here, Evelyn," the voice came, not from a single direction, but all around her, as though the house itself had a voice. "We've always known you." Shook her head violently, her heart pounding in her chest. No, I don't belong here. I never wanted this." But the house did not answer. Instead, the walls stretched even further, opening up like the jaws of some ancient beast. Evelyn staggered back, her legs shaking, but there was nowhere to run. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the darkness, a figure she had seen before 1,000 times, in every room, in every shadow. The man from the portrait, only now he was no longer a man. He was a part of the house, part of it. His face was no longer human, but twisted, contorted, as if the walls themselves had shaped him. His features were blurred, shifting, merging with the architecture, his skin melding with the wood and stone. The edges of his face were jagged like a broken mirror, and his eyes, those eyes were empty, hollow, and yet filled with something. Dark. Something infinite. "You don't understand," the thing said, its voice both human and not, vibrating through her very bones. "You were always meant to be here, Evelyn. You and I, we are one." The words seemed to reverberate in her mind, shattering whatever fragments of clarity she had left. This thing, this abomination, wasn't just part of the house. It was the house, the soul of the house. The one who had always waited, always hungered for her return. Her breath caught in her throat as she stepped back, fear surging in her veins. The thing stepped closer, and the mansion seemed to shift again, the walls pulling in tighter, pressing around her like a vice. "You were always mine, Evelyn," it whispered, its voice 1,000 whispers woven together, overlapping, until it became one terrifying sound. "The house knew you. You're part of it. You've always been part of it. You just didn't remember." Evelyn's legs gave way beneath her. She crumpled to the floor, her hands clutching at her chest as the weight of its words sank in. Her vision blurred, spinning like the broken glass from the mirror. She remembered the mansion, the walls, the twisted figure in the portrait, the house. Had always known her. The truth hit her with the force of a sledgehammer. "You remember now," the voice echoed, its presence suffocating. "This house was built for you. You were the one it was waiting for. You were the one it called to." Evelyn's mind flashed back, pieces of her past unraveling before her eyes. She had been here before. She had lived here. It's long ago, in another life, in another time. This house had been hers, and she had left. But it had never forgotten her. Now it wanted her back. Her throat constricted as her pulse thundered in her ears. And the house was feeding on her fear, on her pain. It was alive, and it needed her. The walls closed in even tighter now, and the air grew thick, suffocating, a heaviness that pressed down on her chest. There was no escape, no way out. "You belong to me," the voice whispered. As the figure moved closer, its form merging with the walls, its outline now indistinguishable from the very mansion itself. Evelyn gasped for air, her hands clutching at the floor, as the weight of her own memories collided with her reality. She had never truly escaped. The house had been waiting for her to return. She had been born here, shaped here, and it had never let her go. And now it would claim her once more. "You are home," the voice whispered one last time. As the darkness closed in around her, swallowing her whole, the darkness swallowed her whole. Evelyn's body felt as though it were being crushed by the weight of everything: the house, the memories, the truth. The air was thick with despair, suffocating her, choking out the last vestiges of hope. Her hands shook violently as she pressed them to her chest, as though trying to hold herself together, trying to stave off the inevitable collapse. But it was useless. She had been here before. She had always been here. The house pulsed, its heartbeat thrumming beneath her feet within her. The walls whispered her name again, as though calling her home, as though she had never left.
Yeah.
And in the flickering, stuttering light, Evelyn could see the reflection of her own face in the surface of the floor, in the warped glass of the windows. The walls themselves seemed to dissolve into the shadows, revealing the truth that had been hidden. For so long, she had been born here. This was her birthright. The house had made her, shaped her, and it had waited for her to return. Every room, every corner, every crack in the walls had been designed for her. The house had known her, had cradled her in its dark embrace, and now it was calling her back, claiming her once more. Her memories collided in a whirlwind of forgotten faces, half-formed thoughts, and long-forgotten whispers. She remembered a time when the house had been a place of comfort, a place of safety, before it had twisted into this nightmare. Before it had consumed her family, her loved ones, and ultimately, her own mind. But there was one thing that remained, one truth that Evelyn could no longer deny. She had never left. The house had always been a part of her. A scream bubbled in her throat, but it was strangled, dying before it could escape. The walls stretched outward, and she could feel them. Feel the house itself, pulling at her soul, dragging her deeper into its heart. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, until they became one overwhelming cacophony. "Welcome back," the voice said. The figure, the thing that had once been a man, emerged from the shadows again, its face still an amalgamation of human and house. But this time, there was no malice in its eyes, no hunger. There was only the deep, abiding truth that Evelyn could no longer deny. "You belong to me," it whispered, as the house around them seemed to breathe, very walls wrapping themselves around her like a lover's embrace. Evelyn's knees buckled. She collapsed to the floor, her body trembling violently. The world was spinning, her mind was spinning, but through the haze. She understood. This house was her prison, but it was also her origin, her past, her future. It had shaped her life, her choices, and now it had come to collect the debt that was owed. "You were always meant to return," the voice said, soothing, soft, but there was no kindness in it. "We were always meant to be together. This house, it needs you, and you need it." The figure moved closer, melding with the walls, its form becoming one with the dark architecture of the mansion. The air grew heavier, as though it were pressing in from all sides. Evelyn's breath became shallow, her chest tightening as the weight of everything the past. The present, the house pressed in on her. She felt herself losing control. Her limbs were growing numb. She could feel the house inside her, creeping into her veins, suffocating her thoughts. There was no escape, no way out. She was part of the house now, and the house was part of her. But then, a single thought, a single sliver of clarity, pierced the suffocating fog. The mirror. The mirror. In the hall, the one she had shattered. The one that had reflected someone else. The broken shards scattered across the floor had shown her a different face, not the face of a victim, not the face of someone trapped. It had shown her the face of the house. Itself, the house was not just a structure of wood and stone, was not just a place. It was an ancient living entity. And she had been its creation, its vessel, its keeper. For the first time, Evelyn understood. was not here by accident. She had chosen this. She had come back to reclaim her birthright. The house had always been waiting for her, just as she had always been waiting for it in that moment. Evelyn's eyes snapped open, and she saw the mansion for what it truly was. It was not a place of horror. It was not a prison. It was a home. Her home. The home that had been waiting for her, patiently, through the long years. She had been born from its very bones, its wood, its walls, and now she would return to it. Her fingers twitched, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she felt alive. The oppressive weight of fear, the suffocating darkness, all began to melt away. The walls stopped pressing in on her. The voices grew distant, fading into silence. The house welcomed her. She stood up, her legs steady beneath her. The figure that had once been the man from the portrait was no longer an enemy. It was a guide, a guardian. It smiled, its eyes softening as it watched her. "You have come home," it said, its voice now gentle. "Welcome, Evelyn. Welcome home." And as the house embraced her, folding around her like the arms of a long-lost lover, Evelyn knew that she was no longer trapped, no longer lost. She was part of it. The house, the walls, the foundation of everything. This was where she belonged. And as the mansion's heart pulsed with life, Evelyn's reflection in the walls slowly shifted. No longer a woman lost in fear, but a woman who had come into her own. The house had claimed her, but in return, it had given her the only thing she had ever needed, a place to belong, and the house would never let her go.